In 587 of the First Age, the War of Wrath came to an end, and Morgoth's destructive rule from Angband was over. But this wasn't a time of sunshine and rainbows for the surviving elves. Over the course of the First Age, 4 major elven kingdoms had been destroyed, along with many other smaller realms. The early Second Age would undoubtedly be a time of picking up the pieces and rebuilding something from nothing. So let's ask the question, how many elves were around to do this? How many elves actually survived the First Age? When you look at what actually happened during the First Age, your first response might be, not many elves at all. As I said in the intro, the Elves of Beleriand faced an unparalleled amount of destruction during their wars against Morgoth. 4 major kingdoms, Hithlum, Nargothrond, Gondolin, and Doriath, were destroyed, either by Morgoth's forces or by friendly fire. On top of that, many other non-kingdoms met their ends as well. Dorthonion, Thargelion, the March of Maedhros, Himlad, and the Falas. Even refuges like the Havens of Sirion were destroyed during the horrific Third Kinslaying. In regards to the realms that survived, well, we only really have 2. One was the Isle of Balar, ruled by Círdan and Gil-galad, mostly inhabited by survivors from the destruction of the Falas, although refugees from other realms were present. However, Balar was not a big island, and when it is discussed during council sessions in Nargothrond, it's heavily implied that the island can't really support a large population. Gwyndor, a nobleman of Nargothrond, suggests that those of Nargothrond who can't defend themselves should be sent there, but the idea is shot down. The other realm is Osiriand, the peaceful land of the Green Elves, on the eastern edge of Beleriand. Unlike Balar, Osiriand was not protected by the ocean, but nevertheless, it's never said to have been conquered by Morgoth's forces. That's not because Osiriand was a major power, it was because it was probably deemed as irrelevant, and that it could wait its turn. Along with the native Green Elves, we're told that the surviving Feanorians also dwelt amongst them. Given how warlike the Feanorians were, and how they launched 2 major attacks on their fellow elves after they lost their own lands, it seems likely that their numbers had been massively reduced. In fact, Maedhros and Maglor's actions after the War of Wrath might imply that they had no real followers left. And although it certainly isn't necessarily representative of the average population, we need to only look at the Noldoran nobility by the end of the First Age to see how deadly these wars were. Of the 17 male princes of the Noldor who came from Valinor, only 2 survived the First Age, Maglor and Celebrimbor. And there's an asterisk next to Maglor's name because at the very least he went missing, but also possibly may have died as well. Based on all of this, it seems like that, of the hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of elves who lived in Beleriand, only a fraction of them survived the First Age, possibly as little as 5 to 10% of them. That is an absolutely catastrophic rate of death, and it's made more grim by the fact that most of these deaths would have occurred in only a span of 90 years, from 455 when Morgoth broke the siege of Angband, to 545 when the host of Valinor arrived in Beleriand to begin the War of Wrath. This is a good time to mention that we're told that the Elves of Beleriand didn't actually take part in the War of Wrath. After 90 years of suffering, they sat that one out. But Tolkien's descriptions didn't always match his ideas. For example, in regards to the Edain, we're told that they numbered no more than 30,000 or so when they arrived in Beleriand. And then, somehow, even though they suffered bitter losses and their lands were conquered by Morgoth, we're told that by 82 of the Second Age, 300,000 Edain had been transported to Numenor to become the first Númenóreans. They grew exponentially despite being the victims of, well, genocide. I spoke about this more in my video on issues in Tolkien's worldbuilding. So even though the Elves of Beleriand were seemingly almost completely wiped out during the First Age, we should look ahead to the Second Age and see what they established. Firstly, there was the Kingdom of Lindon, which was established and ruled by Gil-galad and included at least 3 major settlements in Mithlond, Harlond, and Forlond. The second realm, Eregion, was established in 750, either by Celebrimbor or Galadriel, depending on which version you want to believe. And finally, around the same time, some groups of Sindarin elves who were originally from Doriath departed further east and took up rule in the majority Sylvan realms of Lorien and Greenwood. Now for men, 750 years is a long time, but for elves it really isn't. Tolkien wrote that elves usually had children no earlier than 2,000 years old, so while there might have been a large spike in children at the beginning of the Second Age, those children certainly wouldn't have had children of their own until towards the end of the Second Age at the earliest. So, while the population of elves certainly did recover a bit, it did not recover in a way to make Gil-galad's kingdom in any way comparable to the ancient kingdoms of Beleriand. But at the same time, the elves could not have been that spread thin or that weak either. We know this because during the War of the Elves and Sauron, Eregion held out for 2 years before it was destroyed. As for the rest of Eriador, it took Sauron another 2 full years to conquer it, with the exception of the newly founded Rivendell, the Númenórean holdings on the coast, and Lindon, which Sauron was unable to breach. Although the elves would have been doomed without Númenórean intervention, it does show that they could go toe-to-toe with Sauron for many years, definitely not indicative of such a weak kingdom. And 1700 years later, the Elves of Lindon were said to have recovered and were able to contribute one of the larger forces of the last alliance. So if the Elves of the First Age only really survived in places like Osiriand and the Isle of Balar, how did they reach major power status in the Second Age? Well, it's because they probably didn't just survive in those 2 places. One thing that Tolkien makes clear is that in the dying days of Beleriand, many elves and men wandered or hid as outlaws. Outlaw normally has a negative connotation, and while some outlaws were bad people, Tolkien mostly uses it to describe those who had lost their homes. Some examples of this are Barahir's band and Turin's outlaw band, the Gaowaif, the Wolfmen. While these 2 groups were made up of men, we know that elves were also left in the same situation. For example, Tuor is fostered amongst a group of grey elves who were dwelling in caves in the mountains of Mithrim after Hithlum had fallen. Most of them attempt to make a break towards the south in 488, but even afterwards we are told that there are still some living there. Another example is in Dur Cuarthol, the short-lived outlaw state that Turin and Beleg create between 487 and 489. Originally a band of barely 50 men, the deeds of the group attract many other outlaws, both elves and men, until their power is said to have been swelled. Beleriand is a large place, and there's lots of forests, mountains, and caves, and remote lands that were never properly settled. When their kingdoms were destroyed, there's lots of places that the elves could have fled and survived for a long time, as long as they kept a low profile. Realistically, there could have been hundreds or even thousands of these small groups scattered across Beleriand, hiding, hoping, and waiting that some power from the west would deliver them. They might not have even been hiding in Beleriand. In one version of their tale, Galadriel and Celeborn actually travel east over the Blue Mountains, probably with a few followers, as they were usually always accompanied in the Second Age. Other elves could have done the same. The other place that elves could have survived in is, well, Angband itself, as slaves. While Morgoth was all about destruction, he recognised the usefulness of captives, especially the Noldor, who could create far superior works than his orcs. So when he could take his enemies alive, he did, and when Angband finally fell, we're told that, out of the deep prisons, a multitude of slaves came forth beyond all hope into the light of day. In case you weren't aware, multitude means a large number. Presumably, many of these slaves might have went to Valinor instead of staying in Middle-earth due to the hurts accrued during their captivity, but we certainly can't make that assumption of all of them. So on top of those who survived in the few civilized places that remained, there might have been thousands, if not tens of thousands, of more elves who survived the First Age as captives and outlaws. If many of these also chose to stay in Middle-earth, it might mean that Gil-galad's new elven kingdom was actually a lot more powerful than we originally thought, and it might explain how there were expansions to places like Eregion, and how groups of Sindar were able to travel east and assume control of places like Lorien and Greenwood. So, how many elves survived the First Age in Beleriand? Earlier in the video, I said that perhaps only 5 to 10% of them survived. Personally, I believe that number is too low because A, Lindon seems to have been a lot stronger than that, and B, we established that many elves probably survived in other places. So what is my revised estimate? Well, it still sucks. I'd say with absolute certainty that 50% of the elves perished, and I'd say with slightly less certainty that the number could be as high as 70%. How many survived then? Well, I'd be comfortable saying around 20 to 25%. So 1 in 4, 1 in 5. But probably no higher than that. Still horrific odds. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. It's always difficult to make assumptions when you don't have access to any raw numbers, so we have to go by vibes. Educated vibes perhaps, but vibes nonetheless. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I could have survived the First Age simply because I'm built different.